Hello everyone, my name is Brennan Marr. That noise you're hearing is my ventilator. Welcome to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. But we're not going to be talking about Star Wars today. Last year, 2025, was a very good year for the horror genre. 8 Academy Awards went to horror or horror-adjacent films. And of course, anytime we discuss the genre of horror, there is only one guest that I can think of that is definitely the right person to talk to on this subject. So returning to the show, it's our good friend Lego. Hey Lego.
Hello, hello, hello. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. I think the last time you were here, we talked about Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yes.
Which is ironic, because I'm doing a rewatch of it right now. So the timing was perfect. So,
Always good to rewatch.
Yeah, always a good time. Last year being such a big year for the horror genre, I wanted to talk about the archetypes of horror, and particularly focus on maybe the 2 most important archetypes in horror, in part due to the success of their 1931 films from Universal Studios. And because these archetypes have been in discussion lately, I thought it would be good to address what they mean culturally, what they represent, and why they are so powerful in terms of capturing the imagination. So let's begin really with the one that defined it all. And we'll start because, arguably, the first science fiction novel ever written, arguably, was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, published in 1818, and made certainly very famous by the 1931 film, directed by James Whale and starring Boris Karloff. So let's begin there with Frankenstein, or its alternate title, The Modern Prometheus. And the idea of Prometheus is also in the imagination, because 2 years ago with Oppenheimer, the film begins with a text about Prometheus. Prometheus, in Greek mythology, stole the gift of fire, or the gift of creation, from the gods, and was punished for all eternity. And there are similarities in the novel Frankenstein about a man finding the power to create life and being tormented by that creation for the rest of his life. So let's begin there. Lego, what do you think it is about this story that has captured the imagination so deeply of so many people?
Well, I think first and foremost, if you kind of look at where storytelling was when Mary Shelley wrote the book, I think it was just something that was kind of so out of left field for that era that it was just so different. How could you not be interested in it? And additionally, the language, particularly, I do prefer the 1818 edition over the 1831, I believe, or 1830 edition.
Yes.
The language utilized in it is just so beautiful. The story is so interesting and dark in an era where you had other kind of like ghost stories and such, but this was just something a little different. And as we've seen with so many thematic examples, you can really take the story in so many different ways because, I like to look at it as like a man going too far with scientific experimentation without considering the ramifications and being completely and totally unwilling to deal with those ramifications when confronted with them. It's kind of unchecked privilege. I think that's significantly interesting, but it can be interpreted in so many different ways. And as you were talking about Frankenstein with vampires, I think it's important to note that what predates Bram Stoker's Dracula is John Polidori's The Vampire from also 1818, because they had John Polidori and Mary Shelley had wrote those at the same place. They both created those stories. Well, technically Lord Byron kind of created The Vampire, but they created them the same summer in 1816, the year without a summer really, because of the volcanic eruption the year prior. And so born from that one summer were these two monster stories that revolutionized storytelling going forward. And early cinema often took from literature. And in this case, with the Universal adaptations of Frankenstein and Dracula, they took from the play versions that had already adapted the books to make it a little bit easier, I assume. So Peggy Wembling is the woman who wrote the play adaptation that James Whale adapted. Peggy Wembling's, how she changed Frankenstein, I think is really interesting. I've not had the privilege of reading the play, a little bit difficult to find, and I've looked. But, she kind of focused, in Mary Shelley's book, she doesn't really focus on, like, the creation. She kind of has Victor get the idea, and then it's achieved. Whereas the play goes a little bit into, like, I think she used more alchemy, and to show, like, the creation of the creature. And there's this, and I don't know why, but a lot of people, when they're adapting the book, push to kind of aggrandize and give more status to Victor. I don't really get the impulse to do that. They tend to age him up, make him more educated than he was in the book. They give him more status. They remove the isolation that he had in the book, which I thought was incredibly necessary for the story. They make all these moves to give him more. And I don't know the push for that, but that's just tends to, and maybe it's because that's what Peggy Wembling decided to do, and so that just became what more people ended up being more familiar with because that's how James Whale adapted it. And then there's also the infantilization of the monster and the push to make him more innocent than he was in the book and remove a lot of his autonomy by making him that way, which, makes... It's like they're trying to remove the monster from both the monster and from Victor and make them both more innocent in a way I don't get. I would love to see them both actually be monsters and monstrous. I think that'd be more interesting. But the story, I think, will always fascinate people because you have this, in Colin Clive, I believe, was the actor who played Henry, as he's renamed Frankenstein, in the James Whale adaptation. You had this bombastic performance on his part, and Boris Karloff being he came from, silent film days, so he was quite good at just emoting even behind all of Jack Pierce's makeup so well. So I think it's just so interesting to, like, the dynamic between these two. That'll always be an interesting dynamic. And what Del Toro did was kind of overemphasize the kind of father-son dynamic. And Peggy Wembling actually did have the naming convention in her play. and that became a big part of the play, I believe, is that she had the monster take on Victor Frankenstein's, Henry Frankenstein in the play, name. And I thought that's what they were going to do in the movie, but they did end up going a little bit of a different way. But the naming convention does echo a bit in Del Toro's adaptation. There's just, like I said, since there's so many different ways you can feature that dynamic and look at that dynamic, being more sci-fi, being more unchecked privilege, going more the Prometheus way, and having people just go too far with, taking science too far and away from what's, normal and natural. Removing a woman from the reproductive system, having a father-son dynamic. So there's just so many ways you can look at the story, and all of them are quite valid and have interesting threads to take a story. I talked so much, I'm sorry.
No, it's good. I mean, there is so much in that novel. And I think that we don't give the credit to the fact that an 18-year-old young woman came up with this story. Which is layer upon layer of meaning and ideas. I think that one of the things to point out is how different the 1931 film is from the novel. It's very different. And in some ways might even outshine the original novel. Not that it's of better quality, but it's certainly what people think of when they think of it. And I think that the importance of these films, and really what is the beginning of modern cinema, really, is how much these have affected us culturally. And certainly when we think of the monster, we think of Boris Karloff. And as you say, the incredible makeup, incredible performance, but very different than the creature in the novel. In the novel, the monster is monstrous. He's violent. He's a killer. He knows exactly what he's doing. The film from 1931 makes him more than innocent, that people fear more than he necessarily deserves to be feared. Whereas there's a reason in the novel why Frankenstein goes all the way to the ends of the earth to get away from the creature that's trying to kill him. And so, certainly, you can almost look at the film and the book as two separate works of art that convey the same idea. But certainly have their own take on it. Now, in terms of what the monster represents, we have seen many stories about an artificial being being brought to life. And the ramifications for good or ill that might bring. You could look at people like Data from Star Trek. You could look at the movie Ex Machina. You could look at so many other works of art about bringing this creature to life that I think does represent in some ways humanity's desire to create. Which, as you pointed out, in terms of scientific advancement, not always thinking through the ramifications of that creation. We are seeing right now great battles over AI. which is yet another thing that science has created that, if not used wisely, could be a real disaster. And it is interesting, to, as you pointed out, the desire in a lot of films to make the monster more sympathetic as a character. Now, one of the things I thought was interesting about the most recent adaptation was that Frankenstein himself was portrayed in the nature of being more petulant, more childish, more obnoxious, one might say.
Yes.
And that's certainly interesting to see that the creator of the creature, I think, is the idea that there's a lot of the creator that ends up in the creation.
Definitely.
Whether by nature or by nurture in many cases. So as far as humanity's desire to create, and how that sometimes can backfire, do you think that that is an element of the story that illustrates maybe one of the dangers of humanity?
I mean, honestly, I would say definitely. Given when this story was originally written, what people were creating definitely wasn't as wild as it would eventually be. Like you mentioned, Oppenheimer. In fact, I would say my favorite Frankenstein adaptation is Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park is totally an adaptation of Frankenstein. It is thematically completely in line with maybe the addition of capitalistic greed being the only thing it really adds on in addition. And except of a singular monster, we get, a mini herd of dinosaur. And Dr. Malcolm, Jeff Goldblum's character, kind of sums it up perfectly when he says, before you even realize what you had, you patented it and you packaged it and now you're selling it. I think that's completely in line with kind of what our world looks like today. It's very short-sighted, and it's often looking at the bottom line, and the bottom line is typically a dollar amount. Do they think that in the short run, will this make them money? And if the answer is yes, they will likely do it without, not even necessarily without considering the ramifications. We've seen in real life a number of times where they were fully aware of dangers and simply didn't really care, which is probably worse than anything poor Mary Shelley thought of in 1818. That's a bummer. People often don't. I don't know what that is. I don't know. I guess they think they're above the getting caught, or just doesn't even enter their mind that would even be something that would happen, which is pretty awful. Like we see with Frankenstein, if in the films, I think there's a little bit of an advantage because typically they are period pieces. They do typically take place in the 19th century. So regardless of if they're making Victor a little bit, worse, like kind of how he's portrayed in the books, you use the word petulant. I think that's definitely a good description in the book. He's just this fainting, whining young man, quite annoying actually. And I guess he's a bit more pitiable, perhaps. I think I did like how he's portrayed in Del Toro's film as maybe a little bit kind of a jerk, really. I appreciated that move. I think my favorite adaptation, I mean, actual adaptation, Jurassic Park joke aside, is the Hammer um, Entertainment version, wherein Peter Cushing plays him, and he's pretty reprehensible. He's a outright murderer, very intentionally, and can think really. Oh, he's very hyper focused on the creation. And I guess I have more empathy for someone who's just does have that hyper focus, who just is so interested in the science. They're kind of that chaotic neutral that if you watch She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, like Entrapta, who's just so hyper focused on the science that it doesn't even occur to them to look outside of what that's and see what that science could potentially do until maybe it's too late. I have some empathy for that, but for people who, you know, for corporations, I don't think that's an excuse, I guess, in the grand scheme.
Yeah, very well said. You know, it's interesting we mentioned Oppenheimer a few times. Because you have, you know, the true story of the idea of creating the atomic bomb with the desire to end the war, end World War II, but without considering the ramifications of what that might lead to in the future. Of the idea that you've created the most destructive force we can think of. And it was an idea that this is going to end all war. Well, here we are 80 years later, and that war has not ended. There is still conflict all over the place, and the haunting final line from the movie is Oppenheimer saying to Einstein, you know how you said this might destroy the world? I think it already did. I think that's the last line of the movie. And it's a haunting line about that we have unleashed this force that could potentially destroy all of humanity at some point. So yet again, it's a story of creating something without considering what the result of that might be. And certainly when Frankenstein creates the monster, he has a desire to create life, but doesn't consider where that might lead. One of the things I find interesting about the monster is, as I said earlier, the way that he is in the book and the way that he is often in film. Now, in terms of the idea of the creature being, I don't know if I would call the creature evil, because I don't think he necessarily knows better. But what is it in that original story you think that makes him as violent as he is in the story?
Well, I would say his violence comes as a direct result of Victor's actions. The creature is definitely, I wouldn't say he's evil at all. I wouldn't say, I would say very specifically, he is out for revenge. He gives Victor options, and he gives him choices, and when Victor just is so, I don't know, paralyzed with inaction, and so the creature is not, and so he reacts to Victor's inaction and Victor's reluctance to aid him and befriend him, because interestingly, well, I'll take it back to Oppenheimer, sorry, but with Frankenstein, Victor and the monster are both kind of locked in isolation. Victor through his own choices, and the monster because he doesn't have any option to have any society because he is so othered, unfortunately. And I don't know if they existed at this time. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with colloquially what were known in the US anyway as like ugly laws. And these were laws that did exist in the US even into the 1900s, but I think they were I don't know when they were created, but they definitely existed post World War One for sure. And that was people who were deemed ugly, whether because they had scars, they were blind, they used a wheelchair, they were amputees, whatever, they could get fined or even arrested just for being out in public. I don't know if this was nationwide, but this did exist. And it was extremely harmful, very ableist, really, really gross time period in the United States. And I'm sure stuff like that existed also in the United Kingdom. And there's just always been a lot of stigma around visual differences, beyond just like racism and stuff like that, in terms of like ableism. It's the creature Frankenstein's creature, I can talk, definitely would not have been able to have friends. The only person he really had was a man who could not see him. And when he tried to get Victor to create a companion for him, that fell through real bad because Victor was in his head about it. And probably should have been, that seemed like a right thing to do. But they were both locked in isolation. Whereas comparatively, Oppenheimer, I didn't actually like that movie at all. I'm that nerd who read that like brick of a book that's like bigger and thicker than Stephen King's It. That is a biography on Oppenheimer. I've read a biography on Enrico Fermi, and I definitely hit that hyperfixation on them on that period in World War II. So I think I was just too familiar with their real lives to like the film, and didn't necessarily appreciate the choices that they made. But to say that they didn't know what they were doing, I think is ridiculous. They definitely did. There was so much experiments, and there's so many conversations. They definitely had ideas about what this could potentially do. Beyond just the war. They were not that short-sighted. And they also did experiments on people to see like how radiation would affect people just in generally. They knew exactly what they were doing. I think it's when you have a main character, there's a desire to make them more empathetic for the audience. I think there's a reluctance to make a fully villainous main character. I think it's difficult to have an evil protagonist. So I think on writers' parts, they want to soften the protagonists to make them more relatable and palatable for an audience. And I don't know, in the long run, has that been the right choice? Because, I don't know, not everyone's a good person. And we've definitely seen movies where the main character is just reprehensible, but it's harder to watch that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. I think it is difficult to have a protagonist that is evil. It will be interesting to see in a couple of weeks the next Star Wars series is an animated series about Darth Maul. And the idea of he's going to be the protagonist. But we know he's evil, and the question will be, will they try to make him less evil? Or just as evil as he should be? Certainly, as we say in the book, Dr. Frankenstein is not a good guy at all. And certainly in a lot of the movies, they try to make him more sympathetic. But it's probably a mistake to try to make him too sympathetic.
Yeah.
Because the whole point is that he is not a good person. And that nature extends to the creature. In many ways, sort of replicating the sins of its creator.
Yeah, definitely.
And that, I think, is a big theme as well. The idea of when we create something, sometimes that something will just amplify the bad traits that we have. You know, we're looking, for example, at the third Dune film coming out this year. And one of the things that the author, Frank Herbert, said in an interview was he was fascinated by any leader-type person who their followers would amplify the mistakes of that leader. And in that way, those who follow are being created like the creature and are amplifying the evil or other problems that come from that leader. It's so interesting that there are so many ways to look at this story. And how this 200-year-old story is affecting culture even to this day. Both directly with an adaptation that came out last year, and indirectly with a lot of other stories about creating something. And certainly we can argue that that the creature has led to the idea of androids and other creatures that are human-like that we try to make.
Yes.
So, before we move on to the issue of vampires, is there anything else you'd like to cover on the subject of Frankenstein's creature?
I mean, I think we had a pretty good conversation about it. I would say ultimately, I would love to eventually see an adaptation that is more in line with the book. Although I do appreciate a lot of the. I don't know. I appreciate there's so much variety, but I think it'd be cool to eventually have something that is kind of, hey, this is what the book is, because as you mentioned earlier, more people are always going to have seen a movie than read a book. You know, the views we have about Frankenstein coming from the 1931 adaptation, because that's what more people have seen. So that's become the kind of iconography, and that's what is privileged in people's memories. Is cool. It's great. I love that. I'm so happy James Whale was able to create these off Peggy Wembling's play. But, it'd be cool if they read the book, though. It's not a long book, guys. You can get it for free, I promise. Libraries exist.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to see them do this Regency period piece adaptation. That's exactly what's in the book. They're always making adaptations, so it'll probably happen at some point.
You think it would have?
Yeah, though it's been nearly 100 years and nobody has.
Well, the first adaptation that I know of came out as a short in 1910, I think.
Yes, that's correct.
So it's been a little over 100 years.
Yeah. Now, with the success of the movie Sinners last year, the vampire is in vogue, and arguably the vampire as an archetype has been in vogue for a long time. And it's arguably never gone away. and there's always new retellings of vampire mythology, vampire mythos. But going back to the book that really defined it, even though it wasn't the first, is of course Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula. Which, it's funny because if you count the number of times that Dracula's been adapted to the screen, and vampires in general, it's beyond counting. And every generation, every era seems to have its own vampire story.
Yes.
Just as apparently there's a Slayer every generation as well, So we go back to this novel, which, just like Frankenstein, is an epistolary novel. A novel that is a series of letters make up the chapters.
Yep.
And that's a very interesting writing style that we don't really see as much anymore.
It was common then, though.
It was. It would be interesting if it ever came back.
Oh, but it was kind of boring. Like, just tell the
It
story.
is kind of boring, yes.
Just tell the story, guys. It's fine.
Yes, it does. It is a little bit boring in that style. The novel is great, though I might argue it's a little bit long.
Just a smidge.
And just a bit. There were parts that maybe could have been shorter. But, I mean, who am I to... I have never written a novel, so I can't really say. So, the idea of a vampire is something that fascinates audiences. Now, to me, it's certainly... I would not want to meet one in real life. But as far as fiction, it's made for some incredible storytelling. But let's go back to that original novel. The themes of the novel. I know that at the time it was written, there was a big fear of venereal disease. In that era of sort of Victorian England. Sanitation being rather lacking in some places. And there was that fear of blood diseases. And I think that some scholars have argued that the novel arose from that world. Or that line of thinking, whether that's true or not. But nonetheless, for you, Lego, what are the themes that stand out to you from this novel?
Okay, so to be honest, I haven't read it since high school. I thought it was very drab and boring. I'm much more familiar with Carmilla and the vampire, like John Paul Lederer's The Vampire, which predated a bit.
We can include those as well in the discussion, yes.
So I remember in high school though watching it must have been something on like Biography or History Channel about when Bram Stoker was writing that story and how he would go to the library and he had looked at books on like Vlad the Impaler and how, like certain things that he'd been inspired by, and I think there are collections of his notes that he had wrote as he was writing Dracula, which I always think it's so interesting when we have these older works where we can literally pull like what they were thinking when they were writing them. I think it's a really fascinating thing to look at. And I do think it's important when we're looking at these works to keep in mind the area and the time period that they were written in terms of like what did they know about, I don't know, the spread of disease. Because while that might have been something that was very impactful at the time, was it specifically on his mind? I am not sure. I don't recall like what his inspiration was specifically. or like what he pulled from like his knowledge and in research. But I can say just from the films and the adaptations, we are looking at the move away and the shift away, starting with Polidori's The Vampire, of vampires from mythology being a bit more like ghoulish, a little bit more revenant, kindless, mindless creatures, and shift towards being aristocracy, educated, debonair men who are kind of more like, I think we would look at today as being like a succubus, kind of someone trying to lure people in with their appeal and take their blood. Why he specifically used vampire to tell the story, like what visually did interest Bram Stoker about that idea, what appealed to him about that idea, I'm unsure. I do think with Polidori, that makes complete sense because, he was kind of riffing on Lord Byron, and with Carmilla, that makes sense because it's a story about two women, and we could make that succubus comparison a little bit more clearly there. I think it was kind of a total. Varney the Vampire. I don't know when that came about. That might predate Dracula as well. I don't recall the chronology there. But so it's not fully out of left field. Like, I think audiences at that point would have seen vampires like this before. So it wasn't new per se, but it is a little different. He's definitely adding to the mythos. And it definitely, I don't know when it blew up, but I know he was alive when the play adaptation would have been written because he was working at a theater at the time. I remember reading about that. So, what is it about Dracula? The idea of this, like, I think it's less about like venereal disease and blood diseases in an era that they were still using like leeches to like purify your blood and stuff, which was, I mean, obviously there are some things that works for, but most of the things they were using it for, it didn't. I think it's usually read more and interpreted more as like, this aristocratic man from Transylvania coming to London, I believe. And it's more of like different traditions and different. You can almost look at it in the US. We have horror films that are like Hicksploitation, so you could almost look at it as kind of like an inverse of that. Almost, where it's just like, I think there's this idea at that time period of, Northeast Europe being more culturally different than and maybe a little bit, they're different. They're less, it's a classist thing. They're less educated. They're less civilized. And then you have this man who is wealthy and he's coming, but his tradition, his lifestyle is much different, and there's a clash there. And it turns out, he's drinking blood. Long story short.
Yes. It's very interesting that the evolution of the character when it comes to the screen. Most famous, of course, being Bela Lugosi in the 1931 film. And then about 20 years later, you get the Hammer horror films. And, of course, Sir Christopher Lee as Dracula. And each iteration sort of seems to add something to the story. Now, there are direct adaptations of Dracula. And then there are other vampire stories. And they all evolve with each generation. And certainly we get just, you get the movie Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1992, which in some ways has been argued has led to a more sympathetic portrayal of the Count. And then, of course, you get things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. You unfortunately get the Twilight series.
Oh, hey now.
I mean, I know there's people out there that like them, but I'm not one of them. And then you get, things like Sinners and other things like that. And what the vampire represents, I think, changes.
Definitely.
In each iteration of the story. And can be used in many ways as a metaphor for a lot of things. Sinners, for example, arguably the concept of cultural vampirism, of people's cultures being vampirized by other groups. And that also, as you mentioned, being a classist situation is really what it is. It reveals the sort of the inherent classism, particularly in Sinners, of the white people of the South in the 30s, the old Jim Crow laws, arguably plagiarizing a lot of black art and culture, or trying to replace it with something else. And certainly there's a lot of layers of meaning there, but there was something you wanted to add?
Yeah, well, I said that specific allegory you're talking about, I do think there's films that utilize that. I don't necessarily know if that's 100% what Sinner was trying to do, because they are using, white hasn't always meant today what it did back in the day. And when you utilize Irish people, that does get a little muddy, because while they are white and they do have privileges, they don't have all of them, because Irish people weren't considered. Well, it gets very muddled. That doesn't fully work exactly right. Though it definitely is. I'm not sure I only watched the movie once. I'm not sure exactly what the metaphor was. I don't fully recall. But I think I was just so invested in the music and I didn't love the movie. I'm a horrible person, I know it. But there certainly are movies that are about, Nosferatu. Nosferatu, is definitely about, immigration and people from different places coming with disease. Yes. That definitely has been the case in vampire movies, for sure. Not a vampire movie, but I would recommend, if that's something you're interested in, The Wailing, a Korean film from 2016, very much about colonialism. That's definitely something that occurs in vampire films. And vampire films can go in such a myriad of directions. I don't think it's utilized in Sinners, but if you've ever seen the film Ganja and Hess, that's a vampire movie made by, I forgot his name. I'm so bad with names, but it's a phenomenal vampire film starring the gentleman who was in Night of the Living Dead. He's in that. I think it's in the early 70s, and I like that film so much because it shows what I think a lot of vampire films, particularly in the 70s and onward, were doing, which is showing vampirism as kind of the opposite of something to fear, but rather as a vehicle for liberation. If in becoming a vampire, you are liberating yourself from so many fears of aging, of morality, of mortality, of social mores, particularly often has with vampires, it's gender roles and sexuality. I think it's shown kind of expertly with the Lost Boys, party all night, sleep all day, never age, never die. There's this really cool thing with vampires that they can be something to be feared, like in Sinners, like in 30 Days of Night. But they can be something that you can use to escape your fears. Let the right one in. I think it's a great example of that. Yeah,
Very good film.
it
Very
can go
good.
both ways. It can go either direction. It depends if you want your character to be a vampire or you want your character to be running away from a vampire.
It's very interesting how there have been so many adaptations on those kind of stories. On the one end, it is to be feared, and then in other adaptations, it is to be embraced. And I think that one of the interesting things about Sinners was the idea that the argument that the lead vampire was making was that, join us and we can all be one big happy family, and that's a great idea.
Very Lost Boys.
But the danger it shows is that you might lose your own cultural identity by being assimilated into a group, which I think for me is the message being that we should not all try to be like each other. We should not all be the same. We should all embrace what makes us different.
Yeah.
Because without that, it becomes a very bland world where if we're all just the same, not very interesting. And I think that that's one of the things that makes, vampires being, of course, a story of, anytime there's a story of it, it's always that a group of people that are different. Arguably, and there is much to say about the idea of othering in our society. The thing about the vampire, and of course what we saw in Frankenstein's monster, is that you could fill a library with what these things mean. Because there are so many layers to these stories, to what they're trying to say, to what we infer from these stories, that it's just amazing, because horror is such a great genre, because it is a vehicle to discuss so many ideas, and often in a fantastical way, but ideas that are very meaningful. And why I think horror sometimes doesn't get the love it deserves. It was nice to see that last year, or at least the recent Oscars, did give some love to the horror genre, which is nice. But often I think horror ends up being undervalued a lot. Because there's a lot of horror out there, so much to say. And so many deep themes that I certainly hope that more people come to appreciate just how deep horror films can be. What are your final thoughts on our subject today?
Well, off of what you're saying, I can close it with this. Horror generally being less loved, I think is what needs to be, and by that line, ultimately, kind of in a vicious cycle way, will always keep it underloved. Because the thing about horror is unlike every other genre of film, maybe sci-fi, maybe with the exception of sci-fi, but horror and maybe sci-fi, asterisks, gets to tell the truth because it's capitalizing by its nature on fears, on things that are scary, things, particularly social fears. And by being as truthful as possible, that's the most scary thing that's the most scary way to tell a story. But the thing about like the award ceremonies, about big studios, is they don't want the truth being sold by proxy of that hurts the bottom line, because more people will be offended and more people will, not like it as much. I mean, look at John Carpenter's They Live, right? When you see a big studio making a film about like the horrors of marketing, they pull it from the theater. It's like, would you already put it out? Like, you're wasting your own money, right? So movies like that will always be undervalued for that reason, by their very nature, and they kind of have to be. But that's the way that they are more effective, really. So it's kind of like that weird vicious cycle. It's I don't know, it kind of hurts itself by being itself. That's a little interesting. And for that reason, that's why we get so many horror movies, because they know they're not 4-quadrant movies. They'll be made for less money, and so they'll make them because they don't have to spend as much, and they'll earn a lot because regardless of how they're celebrated, they are seen. They do make money. I think you'll never see that more than I'm a big fan of reading into the VHS boom. And the genre that exploded the most was horror, because it became done cheaply. They can tell any story they want, because essentially you can make anything scary if you understand why people are afraid of it. And with some cool art on the cover, people are going to want to watch it. People are going to be interested in it, because it's that idea of, this is, particularly younger people, like, this is something I shouldn't be watching. And when you get older, it's this idea of, it tends to be more creative. It tends to be telling a story that's different. That's not another rom-com, right? That's not another, big kicky explosion movie. It can be more creative and interesting and vibrant and weird. And so it's telling a story you might not have actually seen before. Even a vampire movie. You've seen 100 vampire movies, but Sinners was unlike any other vampire. Ganja and Hess was unlike any other vampire. Twilight was not like most other vampires. Even though we can see an evolution, we can see a through line into how we get from one vampire to the next. Like, you can go from Dracula to even the Mummy, then to Dark Shadows, then to the 1992 Dracula, and you can see the through line into how we get the evolution into where Francis Ford Coppola, or I don't know who wrote the movie, but how they got to the Dracula that they achieved. And then retroactively, how, taking a step back, like, Fright Night was what it was. You could see, like, the line of how we get from one to the other, and how that lore builds, and how it shifts, and how someone can say, I'm taking, these parts, but I'm leaving those parts. And there's something really cool about horror that gets to be this sort of, like, rebellious child that it's the genre that doesn't have to care. And by not having to care, it's immediately improved and significantly better than most other genres.
Absolutely. I like that, the idea that horror tells the truth, and it's able to do it in such an interesting and macabre way and creative way. And you're right, there is part of the fun of it being taboo in many ways. And you're right. It should remain, I think, undervalued, because if it becomes a big marketable 4-quadrant thing, it might lose some of its edge.
Yeah.
Or it most certainly would lose some of its edge, and part of it is that makes it work is to be subversive, to be weird, to be uncomfortable. And that's part of the fun of it. And of course, the experience of watching a horror film with a group of people is an experience that I don't think any other genre really quite has. In the way that an audience together can jump when something scary happens. Or be on the edge of their seat, with anticipation. And so, the great thing about horror is its ability to be so creative. And certainly, of course, your channel is a great resource for horror. So as we end, thank you so much for joining me, Lego.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Where can people find you and what you're up to?
You can find me on Instagram at the Unhinged Binge. I post there sometimes, haven't lately, but I post a lot of like movie reviews and silly little posters. And if I have a episode of my podcast, you can find there for the most part. And then on YouTube, I'm at Lego Rants, Legault Rants, spelled normally. And I do a lot of like video essays or sometimes just reviews of single films. I think I might still have it up, or I'm working on a new one, which is the evolution of vampires in cinema. But that's, it's a lot of reading. It's not a 6-month journey at all, but it'll be thorough.
Yeah, your video essays are incredible, I have to say. They're so thorough.
And
it's so well researched. I would highly recommend it to people.
Thank you.
Well, Lego, thank you so much for joining me
today
to talk about your favorite genre. Alright, everyone, my name is Brendan Marr. That noise you hear is my ventilator. Thank you so much for tuning in to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. Though today my horror podcast. May the Force be with you.